Now, okay, everyone, thank you very much for joining another Meet the Gurus. Today we have the pleasure of having Jean-Michel Ars with us. Jean-Michel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. It's a
Yeah,
pleasure.
yeah, appreciate your time. Um, as all of you know now, Meet the Gurus is dedicated to technology, business, and entrepreneurship, and way these fields have converged powerfully to change the way we live. MTG is sponsored by Starweaver and devoted to spreading ideas, knowledge, and insights in short form. So today we have the pleasure of learning from Jean-Michel all about digital analytics, transformation, and what it's all about. So let's start with, before we get deep into it, just tell us a little about your background, how you got to the various senior roles you've been in technology, and help us understand your journey itself.
Well, thank you, Paul. First of all, thank you for having me on your channel. Well, my journey has been one that where I learned a lot, and I'm an engineer by training. I'm an electrical engineer, and I started my career as an entrepreneur, starting a small company, commercializing our master's thesis project. And after that, I went to McKinsey, served clients in banking and telecommunications. From there, went to General Electric. There was a group called Corporate Business Development, then went to become the CIO of GE Energy. Then was the CIO of Coca-Cola, the company globally, for almost for 8 years. And in 2010, I joined BMO Financial Group in Toronto and was the head of technology and operations for the bank for more than 8 years. And I founded Coral Systems following that. And our journey has been to develop an integrated analytics platform, which we'll talk about today.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I mean, obviously you've had a very big, both you've had sort of down in the trenches view of how things work. Certainly with McKinsey and your other experiences, but also also strategic views of how things need to be done in big enterprises and how they become as seamless as possible, and with multiple systems, sometimes hundreds, if not more, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the inspirations for creating Coral is just managing the complexity of these transformations and managing the complexity of leading these large scale processes.
So before we get into it, just talk at a very high level. What is, because for someone who doesn't come from the field, you might hear the digital transformation. It sort of sounds like a buzzword on some level, but it has specific meaning to organizations and people in the field.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think, we can just start by the vantage point of every one of us as consumers. Our lives have been changed by the smartphone. Our lives are changed by everything that surrounds the ecosystem that surrounds the smartphone, starting with Google to social networking, with Facebook and LinkedIn, and then with the way we shop with Amazon and others. And those forces are very powerful because they change the expectations of consumers across the board. And that's what we now expect, and the next generation even more so, from every company we interact with. And so for the incumbents and companies that have been around for decades, it's profoundly important that they actually adapt their business system to be able to compete and remain relevant.
And digital transformation is all about that experience, ensuring that the whether it's a seamless experience or a defined experience becomes part of the enterprise ecosystem and DNA.
It is about the customer experience, but it's about more than that. I mean, I think,
Mm-hmm.
you literally have to transform the enterprise at its core, not just the interaction at the customer point, but how its entire operation value chain in business value delivery system works.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk about that today.
Yeah. So I know you have this fantastic discussion piece that you've done before, and I think it's very
Mhm.
powerful. So I thought we would do that. So whenever you're ready, just let me know, and we'll share your
Okay.
screen.
Okay, Paul. Can you see the screen
I
now?
can. Digital transformation in banking.
Very good. Okay. Well, again, thanks for the opportunity. There are 4 points I wanted to cover today. First, what are the forces impacting the banking industry? Then, how can one think about planning and executing a digital transformation? What are the success factors? And then we'll make the connection and the bridge to integrated analytics. Um, So if you look at the banking industry today, there are profound changes that are impacting it, and not least of which is competitors. And we mentioned that in the intro. Fintechs have entered. They initially wanted to compete with banks. Now they're very open to partnerships. But the bigger picture is the risk of big tech. So those enterprises have extraordinary capabilities. And since everything is moving digital, it is something that the banks need to watch very carefully. And then the traditional. And the angle there is that there's a real opportunity for smaller banks to punch above their weight and to gain share versus the larger banks if they build a truly outstanding digital experience. As I mentioned earlier, the expectation of customers and their preferences are changing, and that is true today, but even more so as we get to the next generation of consumers. So people are going to expect everything to be digital and to be truly exceptional from a digital perspective. Moreover, there's in many cases a preference for digital first brands, and they have much larger scale in terms of consumer adoption. The legacy is just the weight that many banks that have been around for decades carry, which is the IT system architecture, the business processes, the applications of the data, which are barriers to moving quickly and barriers to creating the kind of experience that the consumers are looking for today. And then the risk, obviously the pandemic, but cybersecurity and operational risk have become central to every bank. Since everything is moving to digital, there's clearly an enhanced risk here. So the objective as a result is to transform, to simplify these banks, to make them faster, to digitize the way they operate, and also to innovate. And so the bank of the future is going to be very different, and those that don't adapt, unfortunately, I think are going to face some real challenges. So how do you think about architecting a digital transformation program for a bank? Well, essentially, there are many elements to it, but you can think about it very simply in four parts. Number one is how you transform the interface to the customer and the experience for the customer. So that needs to be done outside in. So really thinking about how customers experience the bank, and are we able to create an experience that is competing, fairly with some of the big technology providers. Should be digital first. So you have a lot of channels in a bank, and you should start with digital and take that blueprint and then connect it across all the channels. And it should be integrated across your channels and across the business units. Data and analytics is part two. The foundation of governance and aggregation in the analytic solutions, digitization, how we transform the operations of the bank, and then IT needs to evolve to actually be able to support the bank in this new digital world. So we're going to look at each one of them very quickly. The customer experience, I would say that the bar is very simple. It's set very high. You have to reimagine the customer experience. You have to really compare yourself to the world-class players that are out there digitally, and how you can not only re-engineer your experience, but also make it live in an ecosystem that has changed profoundly, right? If someone's going to make a payment today, or if they're going to buy a home today, they're going to actually go and do search and may use tools that are outside the purview of the bank itself. And that was not true 10 years ago. And so how do you engineer an experience outside in that actually factors in the ecosystem, the digital ecosystem out there? And typically what you have to do is you have to start with the customer and the journeys they have with you. So, how do they work with you on everyday banking, for example? How do they borrow? How do they save and invest? And what kind of advice are they seeking? And then you can actually define those capabilities. You can actually measure the performance that you're looking for and the experience you're looking to create. And essentially the transformation occurs in the operations, in the channel systems and processes, in the end-to-end front-to-back processes, from channels to product operations, and to the enabling processes such as risk and compliance. And then the data and analytics, and we'll see in a second, is really linked in two ways. Number one is you need to have the right data. So the data that provides integration across the enterprise on customer and products is critical. And then there's a whole series of opportunities to transform with analytics as it comes to the customer experience. Everything from leads management, next best offer for sales, the pricing in dynamic pricing, lots of opportunity here, and then the bots for service, for example, at the call center, and so on and so forth. So it's a big element of the transformation for the bank. Second is data and analytics, and you can take that part of the program and break it down into three components itself. The foundational parts are data governance and data aggregation. Data governance is really about making sure that you have clear ownership and accountability for data across the enterprise. It's foundational because if you don't do that, then you will have a brittle data infrastructure for the enterprise. Data aggregation is all of the components and the processes that are needed to actually get the data from your source system. And in a bank, in a large bank, you could have more than 100 source systems. We call them book of record systems, and they need to be actually the data needs to be extracted and moved to one location where it's integrated. You can call it a data lake if you'd like. And many other components need to be built. So for example, reference data. So how do you actually normalize the data across customers and products, and even external data such as market data and so on and so forth is really critical. And then ultimately creating the curated data sets, which are the data sets that have been reviewed by domain experts. Once you have that, then you get to what everyone's looking for, which is analytic solutions. And people are very excited about the potential of machine learning and robotics. Totally agree. Robotics provides a great opportunity to automate machine learning in risk pricing, in other applications. But there's a ton of computational applications in a bank, right? So all the models, the risk models in a bank are computational models built by experts in that field. And then business intelligence, I think, remains a land of opportunity here in banking simply because things are very, very highly fragmented. So we'll talk about that in a second. In terms of the top level of the pyramid in analytics is what are the applications? Well, you can think about it in two ways. What are the applications of analytics that impact channels and therefore the customer experience? And what are the applications of analytics that transform the way the bank actually operates? So the first one is, if you think about your digital channels, which is your online, mobile, tablet, your watch applications, and then all the other traditional bank channels that exist, you can think of applications to first and foremost transform the digital experience. So the interaction with the digital application, with bots and with smart application and with product configurators and other solutions that help transform the interaction with the customer. But then you have the sales element, which is how do you identify new leads for sales, the next best offer, and then pricing. Significant opportunity. There's tons of products, tons of channels, tons of segments, and pricing is a significant opportunity and a very significant lever for growth. And then the cross-channel experience as well, which is how do you thread an experience that works across your channels. So for example, when we did leads management, in one case, we had what we call channel arbitrage. So if you get a leads given to you on a digital app, you don't want to show up at the branch and have the person tell you exactly the same thing, right? The systems need to be connected across your channels. Digitization, you can break down into two parts. Number one, the core business processes of the bank, which is how you onboarding, fulfillment, and servicing, which is literally the value chain of the bank, and then the enabling, which is the entire back office. And there's an enormous opportunity for digitization in banks. There's still a huge number of manual processes, which can be automated. Robotics is one way, but there are many other ways to build a front to back, what we call straight through processing kind of capability. And it's fundamentally important not just to drive productivity, but because when you build a digital bank, what happens in the back office becomes highly, highly visible to the customer. So if you have rework, if you have long cycle time in product operations, for example, that's going to show up on the mobile phone, and that's going to become a real problem. So the back office digitization is important. Now here, that takes us to the linkage of the process digitization, and how do you go about that? Well, essentially, you can think about two phases in digitization. Number one is the definition and baseline of processes. So those who have done Six Sigma or Lean, be familiar with this, but essentially you have a define and baseline phase where you want to build a model of the processes and capabilities in the bank. It's very important because it's very complex. So you build that model that defines your core processes, your enabling processes, and you need to understand the economics and the FTE allocation across that. So where are the people? What are the performance measures? What are the defect rates? What are the risks by process? Because when you engineer certain processes, you have to factor that in. And then the redesign, obviously Lean Six Sigma is a robust methodology to do that. And the parallel is you need to actually use reusable components, which is when you digitize processes, think about creating a library of components that can be reused that are standardized across the enterprise. So how do you have an e-signature that's uniform? How do you have an authentication and access control that's uniform? How do you have document management? How do you have workflow? All these pieces need to be componentized and reused. And the same for analytics, which is robotics and machine learning. And so you can see here at the lower part of the chart, you've got your business processes. You've got three families of processes: sales and marketing, the core, which is onboarding, fulfillment, and servicing, and then all the enabling processes, everything from finance, audit, risk, HR, IT, and then the linkage to analytics, which is a very powerful lever to digitize. And basically, it's a very simple framework to help you think through where you target and sequence your improvement opportunities. Next is IT renewal. That's another important part of the program, simply because in many organizations, I'm not going to say in all, but IT needs to be modernized to be able to deliver at the level of capability that's required by these digital banks and enterprises. And essentially what we're trying to do is to build a faster, more nimble, more efficient function, but we also need to transform the portfolio of IT assets. So if you're the CIO coming into a bank like that, you inherit a portfolio of IT assets, which is the architecture and the applications and the data and the processes. And typically, in order to make the bank ready for the future, you really have to modernize that. So the elements of the transformation are: number one, modern IT architecture; number two, organization; three is the operating model; and four is the portfolio. The architecture we'll drill down into a second, but it's about creating a digital core with services and enterprise data. And that allow the developers to build applications with higher level components that are reusable. So we'll come back to that in a second. Organization, all the traditional components of structure, leadership, the mix of resources, employee contractors, global resources, and talent and skills. Skills are changing, and the requirements for skills when you get into robotics, machine learning, AI, agile, DevOps, new enterprise architecture. These are typically skill profiles that may be in short supply, and you need to figure out if you're going to buy or hire these people or rent the talent from one of your partners. But skills is going to be definitely a central issue of the transformation. And then the operating model, which is how people work. You cannot have people continue to work just on waterfall. I think few people do at this point. Everybody's adopted Agile. But then DevOps, which is the automation of the IT process, is so critical, because if you can develop applications more quickly, you have to be able to move them into production very fast. And if you look at some of the competitors you're now dealing with, they can actually update an application several times in a week, for example. If you think about the traditional, or even faster for that matter, and if you think about the traditional bank and the cycle time for updates, you're talking about months, if not longer. And that is a real problem, because the cumulative impact of all these changes over time is going to create a very big gap in capability. So, and then the portfolio, you have to be able to look at the entire portfolio of apps and infrastructure, and then rationalize and have clear application disposition, and then selectively move applications to the cloud, which provides a huge opportunity to run things differently and to become more agile. So what is the core that I mentioned? Well, if you think about the architecture of systems in a bank, I mean, you can think about basically five pieces. You think about the channel systems, which is what the consumer experiences, which is digital first, obviously, but the systems you have in the branch, the ATM systems, the call center systems, and so on. And what we want to do here is to build a series of presentation services. And these services are reusable components that are used as we build the digital first experience that can be extended and reused across all the other channels. Second, you have all the product systems. And product systems basically think about the value chain in a bank, the deposit, the lending, the cards, and so on. You can have a very large number of product systems in a bank, and how you actually modernize those is really, really key. You have all the foundation systems in the bank, which is your finance, risk, compliance, HR, and so on. Fairly complex in a bank simply because of particularly risk and compliance is very complex. And then the infrastructure. And what we're advocating here is the creation of a digital core with two components in it. Number one, it's services. You've got the integration services, which is a service bus to integrate all the components. And second, a library of reusable services that allow developers to build, to basically take out some of the legacy functionality from the various apps and place them in the core so that it can be used uniformly across your channels and across your product and foundation system. So if you think about, algorithms for risk scoring, if you think about the channels level, for example, authentication, access control, customer onboarding, and so on, those would be part of the presentation services, the UI experience. All of these pieces should be shared and componentized so that you can build applications quickly. So it's like a nervous system. It's you've got the enterprise data in it, which is where we do all the data aggregation in the enterprise-wide data science platform should live in the core, and then you can reuse these objects and both the software and the data objects to build solutions across the bank. So very important, lots to talk about there. The digital core here, so we have a little bit more granularity. So the integrated, the integration bus, as I mentioned, the services, and they break down into various families of services. So you should have a library of services that describes all the capabilities you want to build over time, and then your enterprise data, as I mentioned, governance, aggregation, and your data science platform. And then this thing is not built in one phase; it's built over time. What I've seen in many cases, you need as a CIO to get the approval to go ahead with the creation of that infrastructure, and then you build it as projects come along, and you have to select a beachhead that is very strategic. And then if you do that, then you can demonstrate the value and then accelerate from there. And so if I look at the key success factors, in my experience, there are three. One is the partnership, then the blueprints, and the execution. The partnership is really about how the head of the CIO or the CEO works closely across functions and across business units to connect the dots and understand all the requirements, but really play an integration role in terms of building an architecture for the target state. And then the trusted advisors, in the trusted advisors may provide a lot of advice, but ultimately you need to own the blueprints for your bank, and you need to define them very clearly. And that's where I get to the central part, which is what is the current state for all these pieces, right? What is the current state and the target state you're looking for in this transformation from an organization standpoint? From a business capability and business process standpoint, the facilities are going to transform significantly. We saw that in light of the pandemic, and I don't think that we're going to come back to exactly the way it was. Facilities are going to be impacted significantly, both the commercial facilities like branches, as well as the office space. Customer journeys, your products and services, you need to think about whether the legacy products that you've inherited are too complex and whether they need to be simplified. The channels, the information technology, there's a complexity there, the data and analytics, the projects. And this leads me to why we created integrated analytics in a second. But the execution, obviously, the governance, the monitoring projects, the value realization, managing the risks, it becomes very, very complex. And And that is, this picture is really the essence of what inspired my team and I to create integrated analytics. Because if you want to manage this effectively in a large scale bank or any enterprise, you have to be able to see how the dots connect across all these pieces. So let's take a look at what is integrated analytics. So what we created is this platform called CHORAL. And basically, we said, look, you have data from all these different sources, files, data lakes, SQL, NoSQL, and we need to be able to build these elements very, very quickly to be able to understand how the bank works, what is the current state, what is the target state, and we need to be able to make it accessible to everyone and have all that information on a tablet. And so if you think about it very simply, you look at all the elements that we talked about. Well, if you look at a digital transformation, you will need to understand customer experience, data and analytics, digitization, IT renewal. If you drive productivity in a bank, you're going to have to understand the financials very, very closely, and then your expense and revenue drivers. If you lead information technology, you need to understand the financials, the applications, the infrastructure, the operations. Those who lead growth need to understand sales, customers, products, and channels, and so on and so forth. And all of the information on this page resides in a whole number of places in a bank and most enterprises. And it's typically in spreadsheets and PDF files. It's in departmental BI solutions. And I underline departmental because they have been built by, within a business unit, within a function, with a very narrow scope. That means that it's very difficult to actually, if you want to understand the linkage between the financials and simply the expense and revenue drivers, let alone the linkage to the digital transformation, it becomes quite an exercise. And you have a lot of people trying to do this. So if you look at, for example, enterprise productivity, which is the foundational concept of running any commercial enterprise, look at your financials, and you have to have a grasp and a detailed understanding of your income statement, your growth measures, your profitability measures. In a bank, it's called non-interest revenue and trading revenue and non-interest expense, your balance sheet, and so on. But then when you look at how the enterprise is performing, you want to really get underneath and understand what are the expense drivers, what are the revenue drivers, and what's happening underneath, and how do these factors actually impact your financials, and how are they interconnected? If you want to drive a digital transformation, as we mentioned, you've got a strategy, you've got projects, investments, benefits, execution, and you break it down into a series of projects. So let's say you have customer experience, data analytics, digitization, and IT renewal. Well, you're going to have to understand at a level of granularity, in, let's say, customer experience, what are your customer segments? What are the customer journeys? What's the channel mix and performance? What's the customer loyalty? If you digitize, as I mentioned, you're going to have to understand your capability and process model, the FTE and cost allocation, the performance and efficiency of your processes. In data and analytics, you're going to have to understand, let alone just the analytic solution portfolio that you're dealing with, and then go into data governance and so on. So all of these things here are bits and pieces of information that are everywhere. And what we're saying is, if you have a clear blueprint, you can actually build one cohesive solution that pulls it together. And so how do we do this? Well, basically the data, as I mentioned, is everywhere. And I'm sure you have a data lake, but it's, it is not yet fully integrated. And the data lakes are important, but they're part of the answer and they evolve over time. But the stark reality is that a large part of this data will actually reside in Microsoft Excel and other spreadsheets. And some of it will reside in departmental BI solutions, some of it in data lakes, some of it will reside in databases and so on. So what we have to be able to do is to create a model we've developed a technique called the nodal data network that breaks down the information in domains of expertise, and we can push the ownership of that data to domain owners who are the true experts that understand that. But because we follow a common pattern across all the domains, we actually are able to reconstruct a fully integrated picture, which is here in the analytics solution. So if you look at your digital transformation, for example, or the cases we talked about from productivity, transformation, growth, and M&A, you would have in a bank or any enterprise a nodal network that would have all of these different domains. So from financials to people, your processes, your technology, your facilities, your suppliers, your projects, your sales, customers. And you, if you think about these areas of expertise, you can probably in your mind picture the person who leads that in your enterprise. Well, basically, you just say, perfect. That leader appoints one data expert, and we just get the data wherever it is. It could be spreadsheets, it could be in a database, and we're just going to conform it to that standard, and then we're going to be able to connect all the pieces together. And so that's the idea of integrated analytics. I'm going to pause here and stop sharing and turn it back to Paul to see if there's any questions or specific issues you'd like to discuss.
Okay, thanks. That was really fascinating. One of the things that was jumped out at me in your presentation was the kind of the, as I said, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the tech companies that are making, that have done so much and have gone so far so fast. And I just happened to be looking as you were speaking at an article, which is again notably from 2 years ago in Forbes, with the title "How Much Do Banks Spend on Technology?" Hint: it would weigh 670 tons in $100 bills. Now, that kind of sounds, wow, they're really investing in technology. But when you look at the numbers, they show you as a percentage of assets, and this may not be the perfect metric, but for JP Morgan was the highest, Bank of America a few down the line, no more than 0.5% of their assets are being, per year, the value of their assets, how much in their P&L is being spent on technology. Now, I just happened to look at Amazon at the same time, 13% of its assets in spend is on technology. So you've got a 20 plus times gap. Do you think the banks really appreciate the potential threat they're up against?
Look, I mean,
I don't know if that's the way to put it. Do you think they really appreciate the potential that these tech companies have to so-called eat their lunch if they don't do something about this?
I think boards and business leaders in most banks recognize that the world is changing and is changing very rapidly. I think it's at times though difficult to fully appreciate how much change and what type of change is needed to get to a set of business capabilities that will allow a bank to succeed over time. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone has their own view of it. My view is that the change has to be profound, it has to be fast, and it has to be highly focused. And I think it's not so much about how much you spend, mm-hmm. but are you very, very clear on what are the no regrets moves and capabilities that every bank should pursue mm-hmm. to actually prepare itself for this world? And we touched on some of them in the presentation, but when you've looked at the architecture of these banks that have been around for 20, 30, in some cases more than 100 years, the architecture of these banks is very similar, mm-hmm. point one. Mm-hmm. And when you look at it and you say, okay, what would we do with the channel systems and processes? What would we do with the product systems? What should we do with the enabling systems, which are risk, compliance, finance, and so on? What should we do with the infrastructure? What should we do with the data and analytics? There is an answer that actually in an architecture that I think is no regret, and I think allows a bank to gradually migrate to a capability that will make them sustainable. And that means fixing some of the internal capabilities that they need, but also being able to accelerate by partnering strategically. Mm-hmm. There's no way that every bank is going to build every widget for to build a competitive solution. I think some of the fintechs and the ecosystem there is wise to use, but you need to do that by creating an architecture that allows you to actually connect these things. And so the big picture, I would say, is, to me, the key is how you architect the whole target state and how you think about the steps that you need to take to understand. First, you need to understand your current state. You need to be clear on the target state. And there's a set and a sequence of no regret steps that every bank, in my mind, should be taking to actually prepare themselves. And it is not clear to me that all banks understand that.
Right.
And it's not intuitive to someone who has not is not a technologist, and it's not intuitive to someone who has not been inside one of these banks for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it takes someone, took me years to actually understand how all these pieces fit together. It's
Yeah.
very, very complex.
Yeah, it's very complex, and I think in some ways, maybe I'm simplifying, but it's sort of start at home, start in your infrastructure, start in understanding and
That's right.
rationalizing, and being able to. And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is the rise of banking as a service, where there's so many APIs or plugins that organizations that aren't tech companies that know they'll never be a bank, but that they have a value-added feature or function, or maybe it's a way in which they process loans, or a auto loan, or a home loan, or something else that it needs access to that bank information and provide it to it. So so the cybersecurity issues obviously become top of mind in that regard. Do you think the organizations are prepared, the banking organizations in particular, are prepared for this in terms of either having the talent inside or the knowledge to open up those interfaces securely?
I mean, I think you point out one of the top risks for every bank and our large scale enterprise, which is cyber. And I think we've all read about the types of problems that can occur and how significant it can be, not just from a potential sensitive information loss, and we've seen private information being disclosed. But
Right.
the second part people don't think so much about is the operational aspect of cyber. And to me,
Right.
as from a head of operations, that is my biggest concern, because if you look at even what happened in the United States with a ransomware attack that shuts down an entire pipeline, and it disrupts the movement of fuel across an entire nation. It doesn't take very long for people to understand, the potential ramifications operationally for banks and any enterprise in logistics or healthcare or whatever. So yeah, cyber is a huge issue. And it's also a very similar problem to digital transformation in banking, which is it's highly, highly complex. And there's not kind of one answer. People think, I'm going to buy this widget and it's going to solve cyber. It will not.
Right.
I mean, you need to have discipline. And I think the United States government has made it very clear with NIST. If you look at, the CSF, but also the risk management framework, or NIST risk management framework is very good. And it just outlines all the capabilities that need to be put in place. So I would say, number one, every enterprise needs to really bolster their capabilities there and develop a better understanding. Number two, I think architecture is important. So, we talked about the ability to connect with APIs and so on, and there's a way to do that architecturally to make sure that things are more secure. And third, I think the skills that are required to make sure that that's done in a secure and safe manner also need to be bolstered. So it's not something that I would do without having people who are truly leaders in that field, steward as they add this to a bank or any enterprise for that matter.
And one of the things I just sort of to end with is that some of the data it was again a few years old from Cornerstone Advisors, which pointed out that a quarter by 2019, a quarter of all the institutions hadn't had really a digital transformation strategy. And as of today, fast forward to today, 45% are still in some form of not even having made a consequential move. So the opportunity for fixing it and to enhancing it, it's always, you can look at things two ways. One is that the opportunity is past, and you can look at it and say, look how much more there is to change, because the infrastructure and the money obviously that's controlled by banks is not going to change, but it might have to morph in some way, and so they have to morph or be a victim of their own unwillingness to change.
I agree with that. I mean, look, we are where we are. So you've started, great. You haven't started, then, you have to make a decision. And I would say that for any player in the industry, it is an opportunity and a threat. Mm-hmm. And I like to look at it glass half full. I think it's a big opportunity. So for any bank or any enterprise, if you start today, number one, you benefit from the experience and the technology that's evolved. And if the board and the management team, the board, the CEO, and the management team see the train coming,
right,
and they are, because you can see the train coming and not do anything about it, or you can see the train coming and not know what to do.
Right.
I think on the first case, if you choose not to do anything about it, then so be it.
Don't
But I
complain.
think,
Don't complain about the results.
well, it doesn't bode well for the future
Right.
because the change is obviously happening. It's fast and it's profound. If you see the train coming and you want to act, I think there is, I think at this point, a clear set of methods, architectures, approaches that can be applied to actually launch a transformation and be very productive. The complication with that is, there's so many different options to get advice out there that you basically have to go and get the talent within your organization
Right.
who, with the experience and the trust that as a CEO, you can lean on these leaders to actually be able to steward that change and make it happen quickly, precisely, safely, and just deal with all the challenges that come along with that. But I would say it's a big opportunity, and I hope that more banks and enterprises choose to take that on, because I certainly hope that the future is not one where you end up with 4 players kind of providing everything.
Right. Now, it kind of reminds me, just from in sort of closing, that way back in the day, you and I are old enough to remember a company called Rolodex, which made Rolodexes, which for those of you who are young enough to not even know what that means, they were actually cards that you would clip on a wheel, and the wheel would be your contact list, which we otherwise call a database today. And I was always so shocked in the 90s when the Rolodex didn't realize the business it was in. It didn't realize what business it was in. It thought it was in the making of these wheels that you clip these cards into. And they got bigger and bigger wheels for the bigger players who had so many contacts. Reality is they were in the information business. They didn't really even understand that. And it's kind of one of those things that banks, what business are you in? Kind of the interesting question they have to ask themselves.
That's right.
Yeah, thanks, Jean-Michel. Wonderful talk once again, and look forward to, for those of you interested, definitely we are going to have a digital transformation conference on November 3rd. Check it out on our website. Sign up and tell your friends about it, and we'll see you next time. And we'll see you there, Jean-Michel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.